I was at home. One weekend night, my parents were out of town, and I was returning from a sleepover they canceled at a friend's house. Later, when I arrived at the door, I remember that shortly afterwards I received a phone call from that same friend, which would end up being the last normal event of the night. My brother was playing video games in the next room, and I heard him furiously complain about this. While I was on the phone, I walked into the living room and finished the call in the kitchen, when I heard a kind of high-pitched squeak coming from somewhere in the house. I couldn't locate where the sound was coming from, as it sounded exactly the same in all rooms. It ended about 1 minute after it started. He was interrupted by the phone ringing, but the phone was not in the kitchen. Where I left it, it was in the bathroom over the sink. I answered the phone, and no one was there, so I hung up. It was then that I heard a bang, as if a large heavy object was being dragged into the attic above me. I followed the sound as I walked slowly into the room and ended up in my parents' bedroom. At that time, they still had a waterbed. When the sound reached the farthest wall, it stopped and the phone rang again, and this time it was my friend on the line. I told him what was happening, and he told me to be careful and call the police. After hanging up the phone, I lay down on the waterbed. Then I heard a knock on the door, and I answered quickly. Was there no one at that time? I called my brother from his room to check something. I went into his room and there was no one there. His bed was made, his room was spotless. Neither the console nor the TV were on, and the remote was wrapped and disconnected. There was no way she could have hidden and cleaned her room in those few seconds it took me to enter. I had been just tonight listening to my brother for 20 minutes straight playing, but apparently he wasn't present. The phone rang again, but again, it wasn't where I'd left it. This time he was in the kitchen, where he had first left him. So I walked over there to answer. It was my friend calling again, this time saying the call dropped. For some reason he was trying to call again. I explained to him what had just happened, and I heard them knock on the door again, since he was next to it. I looked out the window 2 seconds after the knocks, and there was no one there. At that moment I opened the door and went out to make sure there was no one running away. This was thanks to the view of the open courtyard, and the fact that there was nowhere to hide. I went into the front yard and looked around, but I couldn't find anything. I was engulfed in several more minutes of conversation with my friend before stepping off the line, and it was at that moment that I realized that the place I had been staring at as I spoke were 2 reflective black eyes. They were big, and they were watching me. The figure was tall and lanky, and was about 10 feet or so from me. His most notable feature was an inhumanly large grin, and he grinned with his dirty yellow teeth, literally from ear to ear. Despite having seen him for 5 minutes directly, I pretended not to have noticed his presence, and with my willpower, I managed to return inside the house without running. I walked quietly. I remember if I ran, I felt like I would be chased, and somehow I knew I would get caught easily. I locked myself in the room for the rest of the night, but I couldn't sleep. The next morning the sun came up and my parents came home. Nothing like that had happened before, and nothing like that ever happened again.
This happened in early 2017. I was a 23-year-old girl and had just finished college. The field I studied was not huge in my area, so I decided to leave it. I moved to the largest city in our country to do a graduate course and look for a job as I was still unemployed. I decided I would expect to make a long-term rental as the commute to work is a puzzle. The first months I was changing from Airbnb and hostels. All the time I was already tired of this, so I decided that this would be my last move, and then, still without a job, I would settle for it. I was running out of money and decided to stay in a dorm room next to where I was taking classes. Sharing a bedroom is not an issue for me during a trip, but when you live in a place trying to create a routine, sharing the bathroom with complete strangers sucks. Would I share a bedroom with 3 boys? But it was not with any of them that my bad encounter occurred. They were nice, apart from the fact that one of them snored a lot at night wasn't a big deal, while in the other bedroom was the creepiest person I've ever seen. He was about 30 years old and didn't travel. He was a native of the city we were in, and he was using the hostel as his new home since his parents had kicked him out of theirs. He introduced himself and tried to be kind and flirty to me in an initial way, but I declined his advances. He kept following me all day at the hostel. Wherever it went, it showed up in less than 5 minutes the second day. There I left the hostel to go to a job interview, and when I got back to the hostel already late, he was sitting on the entrance stairs waiting for me. He followed me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He bought me snacks, asked me out, tried to get information about my personal life. All these things when I had already made clear my lack of. In this friendship, all this happened in 3 days. I was exhausted from his presence, but what I didn't know is that this would get worse. As soon as one of the boys who shared the bedroom with me left, he asked the hostel staff to change him to his bedroom so he could stay in the same one as me. He obviously didn't tell me, so imagine my surprise and disgust when I saw him walk into the bedroom with all his belongings. I was so frightened by his presence that I went to bed in jeans to avoid it. Any kind of advantage he could get while I slept. The next morning I decided to leave the situation, which by the way got worse and I couldn't stand it anymore. While I was packing, the guy seemed to notice what I was doing and started crying, asking me not to leave him. That made things even more creepy and nasty. He told me he would miss seeing my face while I slept and to thank God for taking pictures. I tried my best to stay calm, but I lost my mind when he told me that he had taken photos while I slept. I took the phone out of his hand and started looking at all the photos. Sure, I deleted absolutely all of them. There were a bunch of pictures of me sleeping from the night before. I left the hostel and I really regret not reporting to the staff. Crazy lonely guy in the hostel. Please, let's never meet again.
The first time I came face to face with a strange man was 7 years ago. It was a normal summer day. I didn't have a terrible childhood, but it wasn't great either. We lived in a small 2-bedroom house. It was my mother, her boyfriend, my 2 little brothers, and me. My mother and her boyfriend worked nights, so I had to take care of my brothers at night. At first it was like any other normal summer day. My friends and I would go out during the day, walk through a small town and enjoy the warm weather. Now, being in a small town, there's not much to do. Walking in the woods, going to the park, all the typical kid stuff. We just had to waste time in the park until I had to go home to take care of my brothers. They were normal and boring things. We walked around the place. We played with a basketball that someone had left behind. We'd sit on the swings talking about our lives. It was 3 p.m. when I saw a guy who was sitting on the bench near the basketball court. Anyway, it was almost time to go home. Anyway, and since the subject was looking at me and my friend with a perverted face, we decided to leave when we approached the main street, where our house was also. We split up. I got home, and my mother told me there were leftovers for me and the boys. Then he went to work. We spent most of the day at home watching TV or playing video games. Around 7:30 a.m., my brothers wanted to go out by bike. I accepted even though it was getting dark. They played for half an hour. I'm sitting in the sand, looking at my phone, texting my friend about how bored I was when my younger brother, who must have been about 7 at the time, came up to me and pointed. Behind our house he saw what looked like a man entering the house. I immediately told my brothers not to worry, to keep playing. Then I called my mother to let her know what was happening. She called the police and they showed up 5 minutes later because the police station was nearby. They did a full search of the house, but they didn't find anything. They spoke to my mother on the phone to tell her there was nothing, and that it must have been our imagination. Tentatively, my brothers and I go back to the house, so we watch TV. Time flies. I look up and it's 9:30, so I have to get them to bed soon. I have to go upstairs to the bedroom, so all our clothes are in one closet because the three of us share a room. I turned on the closet light to rummage through the pile of clothes on the floor that we never got to put away, and heard a noise that sounded like deep breathing. I thought it was just my imagination, but I keep getting my brother's pajamas out. When I was done, I pulled the string to turn off the lights, but there was movement in the corner. I checked the pile of clothes and found a man's face. There was a man hiding under the clothes in the closet. I made a sudden movement and he noticed. I ran out and heard him fight his clothes, and I didn't stop running down the hallway, down the stairs, hitting anything in the process. I wanted to block his way. I reached the living room and took my brothers by the arms. I was practically dragging them out of the house. We were out 3 blocks away before I stopped dragging my brothers. I looked for the phone to call the police, but it wasn't in my pocket. I should have left it on the couch, so we left it. I took my brothers behind me in the middle of the night. They were tired and didn't know what happened. I wasn't going to tell them. They didn't need to know. They wouldn't want to go back to the closet. We never got to the police station, and they called Mom. Then they took us home and she left work early. They did another full search, and this time they found nothing new. Just my mess, no evidence, nothing. As they left, they told me not to waste their time. My mother said to believe me, of course. She was trying to comfort me. It was the most natural thing to do. He said he could spend the night at a friend's house. If I can find someone I feel better with, we all go in, and my mother tells my brothers what they did before going to bed. I walked over to the couch where I left my phone, but it wasn't there. It was on the floor in pieces. It was very obvious that it had been smashed with a hammer, for it was next door. I called my mother and showed her my phone mess on the floor. He went to the closet and pulled out the toolbox we had. He opened it and our hammer was still in there. At the time I didn't realize what it meant. But now I think that this man came into our house in my closet, in my room with a hammer, waiting and wishing that my brothers and I would fall asleep. I pray we never find him again. This happened a few years ago, during my summer vacation, when I was home alone. I had finished cleaning my room after procrastinating for days and was finally relaxing on the couch playing video games. Out of nowhere, I heard someone calling me at the door of the house. I've always been a rather paranoid person, so I took the poker from the fireplace and walked slowly to the door. Outside the house was a 20-year-old guy in a blue baseball cap, a gray sweatshirt, hoodie, and black jeans. He was also holding a suitcase. I watched him for about 20 seconds, waiting for him to leave, but he kept knocking on the door and then started looking out the windows. I quickly hid behind the sofa since I didn't feel like talking to anyone. I finally see him pull out his phone and whisper something to someone. Then, moments later, I heard a sound that froze my blood. The kitchen doorbell was ringing. I thought, how could it be possible if this man was standing inches away alone in front of the window? I wish I hadn't had the answer to that question, because I suddenly heard the back door of the kitchen open. Suddenly, another man dressed in black came into my house with a metal baseball bat and a black garbage bag. I tried to control my breathing as best I could as I watched them open the front door and let the first man in. They immediately began to rummage through the drawers and toss valuables into the trash bag. From the last corner of the house, sitting behind the old couch, there were a couple of boxes that covered me old. I think someone must be around here. Why would they leave the TV on? He expressed one of them. I was right in my hurry to hide. I had forgotten to do precisely that. The panic increased when the men were a few inches from where I was hiding, and while I closed my eyes, fearing the worst, they miraculously headed to my parents' room, passing by me. He was stunned. There was no way he thought of fighting those two intruders. So I decided to make the next best option. While they were free to take our valuables, I went out the back door, ran out to where the neighbor was, crossed the street to find him. Luckily, I managed to get her attention as she was in the backyard playing with her kids. After learning about the situation, he let us in while calling 911. Immediately afterwards, I started recording with my phone. I managed to record them as they left the house. I caught the vehicle on camera, its license plate, and, of course, the thieves. With this evidence in hand, the police were able to arrest them within a couple of days and, luckily, they returned almost all our valuables to us. As for my mother's jewels, they were missing, but luckily they were traced to a local pawn shop a week later. As for the second man who came into my house, it could have been my fault. I hadn't locked the door properly. I still believe the first man was the distraction, while the second was looking for a way in. This happened in the spring of 2007, when my friend and I were on a month-long backpacking trip through Europe. We started in London and took every imaginable means of transport through France, the Netherlands, Germany, and finally we finished our trip in Italy. Because of a bus delay, we arrived in Rome several hours later than planned. The people at the inn said they assumed we weren't going to show up, and they rented our beds to two other travelers. They said there was nothing to worry about, since there was another property in the city where they rented for this type of occasion. This was a two-bedroom apartment with several bunk beds in rooms. Here we spent our last 3 nights in Europe, with a group of young Spaniards with whom we were going out to party and having a great time. On the last day, our Spanish friends left and were replaced by a group of 10 Latin American men and women whom we met briefly before going out on our last night in Rome. We had a couple of communication problems, but everyone seemed friendly and got along separately. My friend and I returned to our bunks at 2 in the morning, 1 hour later. The other group arrived clearly drunk. They all got into their bunk beds, and within 15 minutes they had the lights out and started snoring. All but 11 of the young people in the top bunk, right in front of mine. He was still awake and seemed to be playing with his phone. I closed my eyes and began to fall asleep, just as the bright light hit me directly in the face, and I heard the flash of his phone, annoyed but non-confrontational. I turned my back so he could go to his bed. I thought it was for the best, yet he kept taking pictures of me, whispering obscenities in English, which I won't repeat here. I realized that being passive was the wrong strategy. The moment he got off and crept up on me for a few moments, he just stood close to me, apparently with his hands on the top bunk where my fellow travelers slept. At one point my heart rate went through the roof, and I quickly began to consider options. I suddenly realized that I was in a private apartment, with no other travelers or staff in the building. If I confronted this person, I might wake up his companions. I didn't know if these men could be dangerous, and if they were, we'd be fighting for our lives. If they wanted to, they could have killed us and just said we got out in time and no one would ever know about us. I was thinking of kicking the guy in the stomach and running for a knife to the kitchen when he suddenly knelt on my bed. That was it. I sat down abruptly and braced myself for conflict, saying, "Do you have a fucking problem?" He just stood still, without saying a single word, got up and entered the common area. I heard him close the bathroom door. And after 1 minute, he was back in his bunk, and 10 minutes later he was also snoring peacefully. I was awake, fully dressed and ready to fight for the rest of the night. But shortly before dawn, I woke my friend and we walked out of there. He asked me what that guy was doing last night, but I have no idea how he found out about it. We were on a flight to Hatta a couple of hours later, and we didn't talk about it again. So, Stalker photographer? If you ever see me in public, you probably need help.